Well, fantastic. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really looking forward to today's topic, all around where should we store our files. This has been a constantly evolving opportunity for organizations for lots of different reasons. Main one being security, as we're trying to figure out how do we share files securely, but then also access. How do we store our files? How do we back them up? How do we ensure that we have a copy of them, various versions of them? We have a packed full agenda today. And before I jump into the agenda, I just want to kind of introduce ourselves. Today's presenters are, we are NW Techs. We are an advisory firm really focused on helping organizations utilize technology. So we look at small organizations' technology and really look at their entire technology to help them alleviate cybersecurity risk, IT dysfunction, and so things we do a fully managed IT along with cybersecurity, phone systems, other things. Cloud storage has been a huge opportunity for our clients in the past 5 to 10 years. So this webinar is really an accumulation of our entire team's experience. We've created this presentation to kind of give you an historical view of what we've seen with cloud storage, and then also what's relevant today. And we'll dive deep into obviously the big providers like Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, and Dropbox, along with other things. My name is Taylor Wells. I'm the Director of Strategy here at NW Techs. And my goal is to really share with you kind of what we're seeing with our clients, and educate you all on what we've learned with implementing cloud storage and really helping our clients migrate on-premise servers, on-premise hardware to the cloud. Our agenda today, before we jump into the agenda, I'm going to do a couple housekeeping items. The first one being we are recording this webinar. So expect a link in the next 24 hours or so. If you're not able to stay for the whole event, no worries. We'll send you a recording of the rest of the event. Then also we're going to be covering a lot of information. So definitely rewatch it if you want to review some of the information that we went through, or if you want to share it with a colleague, you're more than welcome to pass it along to a colleague. Also, feel free to submit questions through the webinar. You can submit questions in the Q&A portion of the webinar software. If you just click on Q&A, you can submit a question at any point during the webinar, and we'll try to get to it. We'll also, a lot of you, I think we got about almost 100 submitted questions from you that are on the webinar right now, of just questions of things you're dealing with, whether it's, how do we securely share files? What's the best provider out there? How do I migrate away from my server? Compliance, you name it. We kind of went through and picked kind of 10 or so of the top questions we thought that were most relevant, and we'll address those in this webinar. But if there's something that comes up during the webinar that you'd like us to address, feel free to submit it through the Q&A, and we'll be sure to address it. Last but not least, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be providing a lot of content, so feel free to take it. We'll provide a lot of content, but we'll also have some actionable items for you. So throughout the webinar, we'll give you actionable items to take advantage of the information. But during the webinar, I would recommend turn off your cell phone, grab a notepad and pen, take capacious notes, because there's a lot of information we're going to be going through, and I want to make sure you get the full value of the hour of spending time with us today. Awesome. Cool. So those are the housekeeping items. Number one, we're recording it so you can share it or watch it later. Number two, feel free to submit your questions. And then number three, make sure you will have actual items, because there is a lot of content, so don't get too overwhelmed. And then also make sure you turn off your phone. Make sure you just focus in this time taking notes with a pen and paper. Awesome, our agenda. So this is the exciting part. We got lots to go through. The first portion of the webinar, we're going to talk about traditional ways to store files. So what have we been doing for the last 15 to 20 years of really using computers heavily as organizations and businesses? We'll be talking about the pros and cons, advantages and problems that maybe your organization has experienced with storing files on a desktop or a server. We'll be going through all the nitty-gritty of that, so you can kind of see, oh, I can relate to that. And then also maybe we should keep a server or a desktop, and we'll talk about some of the advantages as well. The second thing we'll be going through is the migration to the cloud. So we'll be talking about cloud storage and really the advantages and problems with cloud storage. And a lot of you may already be in the cloud, so we'll be talking about maybe some areas that you can utilize cloud storage more fully. But then also maybe look at some of the problems. We'll talk about some of those problems of cloud storage and really kind of dive deeper into those problems and allow us for you to maybe get educated on avoiding some of those problems of cloud storage. The next thing we'll be going through is what are kind of the cloud solution comparisons. So there's three main providers we're going to be looking at. There is hundreds, if not thousands, of cloud storage providers out there. But the three main ones in the industry are Google, Dropbox, and Microsoft. And they all have very similar feature sets. So we won't necessarily be looking at necessarily all the features that they have, but we'll be diving into, just for the sake of time, we'll be diving into the differences between these three providers and what we've seen as the opportunity for where does each one fit. And then we'll also, at the end, I'll share with you what our personal favorite, which I won't give it away yet, because it is something that I want to educate you guys on and take you through the whole progression so you can kind of see, oh, this is why it's their favorite. And it's actually not our favorite for everyone. It's probably maybe 80 or 90% of our clients we've selected for this one cloud storage. But then there's also fits for other ones as well, depending on your organizational needs. So we're going through the differences. We'll be focusing mainly on the main key differences, like I mentioned, but then also diving into kind of what our personal favorites are and where we've seen success with those providers. Next, we'll be going into best practices for sharing files, secure sharing of files between you and your clients. This is one big area over the past year. We've seen a ton of cybersecurity issues with either sending sensitive information via email or sending a password or just sharing things incorrectly. So we'll be talking through some best practices. A lot of you submitted questions around, hey, how do I share files securely with my clients or in between our team? Because we know things like email is not secure. So how do I do it? And then also all these cloud storage providers have a myriad of ways to do it. So which ones are best? And then if you're still using traditional hardware, whether it's a server or a desktop, we'll talk about best practices there as well to sharing securely. Next, we'll be doing a live Q&A. So we'll be answering your questions towards the end of the webinar and talking through your specific questions you brought up, and then also the submitted questions, like I mentioned earlier. And then last, I'll share some areas of which additional ways for you to get more help with cloud storage. And the opportunity is for us to help you migrate your files to the cloud. And we'll talk about that later in the webinar towards the end. If you already know you need help, I would encourage you, reach out to us. We can at least talk to you, give you a free consultation. If you already know you need help with file storage and you're like, hey, I already know I need to migrate to the cloud, I need to migrate my server to the cloud, or I want to utilize these, either Google Drive or Microsoft 365 or Dropbox more fully, reach out to us. We can do a free consultation, a 30-minute consultation. I will share this link in the chat window. So if you guys just want to go click on the link, you're more than welcome. You can schedule right there a meeting with us for 30 minutes, and we can dive deep into your specific situation. What we've realized is that every organization's problems are different. So I'm going to cover a lot of generalities in here in this webinar, but everyone has integrations and specific compliance or regulatory issues. If you're a law firm versus a medical organization, you're going to have different legal requirements and regulatory requirements to how you store your documents. So be happy to talk through those things. Feel free. I'll put the link in the chat window. If you just want to click on the chat, you can go there, quickly schedule a meeting with us. We'll be talking more about that later as well for opportunities for you to get help from us. All right, let's dive right into traditional ways to store files. So the history behind storing files, there is a lot. And kind of really what are the problems with them, and we'll talk about the problems and advantages. But before cloud storage, we exclusively stored files on desktops, servers, and external hard drives. So it's really up in the past 5 to 10 years that we've had the opportunity to store files in the cloud. So let's talk about the problems of storing files in the cloud. The first problem being they're stored locally. So I'll kind of dive a little bit deeper into this. Files that are stored locally, there's kind of three main problems with a file being stored on a server, a desktop, your laptop, or an external hard drive like a USB drive or whatnot. First one is if you have an internet outage, there's no way to access those files remotely. So if you're logging into the server or if you're logging into your desktop, you may find out, hey, if it's stored in the office and you're at home working and you're trying to access those files, if the internet goes down in the office or if it sputters or if even if it's just low speed, unfortunately, you won't be able to access that file. The second thing is power outages. So another thing that happens is if your office or your home location or wherever those hard drive servers or external drives are located, we know that if you have a power outage, you have to reboot the server. That's its own problem. Not only does you have to wait for the power to come back on, you have to reboot your server. And I'm sure if you've had a server or if you had a desktop that you're trying to access files, that's its own problem of having to make sure the server is rebooted, log back in, get connected. It's very disruptive when that happens. Thankfully, the internet outages, power outages don't happen every day. But if they happen a couple times a year, that could be hours of lost productivity. You add that up over time, and that's definitely a problem and not ideal for your organization. The third thing is fire and theft, et cetera. So there's kind of a potential loss of hard drives, and we'll talk about backups in a second, because that can be one way to solve both of those problems. But ultimately, that's super disruptive. Once again, if you do have a fire or if someone does steal it, fire, obviously you could have a backup for. Someone steal it, you can have a backup for too as well. But then you have that information out in the wild, and who knows what they're going to do with that information. So the theft is definitely a problem, and so is a fire. And so backups are great for that, but ultimately it's super disruptive. And then obviously you have a security issue, right? If someone were to go and break into your office and steal it, you may be asking yourself, well, what about hosting stuff in the cloud? And is that secure? We'll be talking about that as well. But it's just a little bit of a different security problem. And ultimately, if it's in the cloud, it can be susceptible to being compromised. But if it's stored locally, it can be susceptible to not only an outside, in the internet. If you have internet access, you can access the server or the desktop, but then also a physical theft as well. So it has more factors for theft than potentially the cloud does. Kind of the second problem with storing stuff traditionally is remote access. So just things being able to access stuff remotely. So if you're working remotely, if you're traveling, in this day and age, we have obviously a lot of organizations are either fully remote or they're doing a hybrid model, which is pretty great. I'm actually at my home office as well today. I'm working from my home office, which is a great luxury. So if I were to try to access our server, there's two things. First, there's a security concern. Do I have a secure connection between my home office and the server in the office? So that's question number one. There's ways to get around that. You probably have heard of a VPN, which is a great solution, but another cost for your organization, and also it can be a hassle to maintain. And then number two, it can be slow, because what you're trying to do now is you're depending on both internet connections. You're depending on the internet connection at home, but then also the internet connection at your office. So if there's internet speeds, if I'm trying to access those files and the internet sputters, it's obviously going to slow it down in accessing those files. So if you're trying to access a large file, then there's definitely challenges with being able to access those files remotely. And we know that there's a whole myriad of other problems. Those are the two main ones. Security concerns: are you accessing the files remotely? Do you have a secure connection? For example, if you're using a public Wi-Fi connection while you're traveling in an airport or at a Starbucks, is that connection secure? If somebody was monitoring that connection, could they access it? And then number two, if there's any internet issues at any location, that's going to cause potential disruption in your connection. Number three is backups. I've already kind of hinted at this a little bit, but number one is, are you backing up the server? So that's kind of its own task and problem. Is it being backed up regularly? Where is it being backed up to? And making sure it's being backed up on a consistent basis. And that's a kind of a headache trying to back up your server. But then there's also slow recovery. So if your server were to crash, or if you were to have a compromise, recovering it, depending on where the backups are, it's usually a little more time consuming unless it's in the cloud, and you can back it up quickly. So let's say you have a server and you're backing it up to a hard drive. Restoring, so if the server goes down, restoring that hard drive to the server, it can be a very slow recovery, and it can take a lot of time. The third thing is multiple locations. So I don't know how many times you guys have experienced having the file stored on multiple locations. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're working on the file on your laptop, right? You're on the road, you're working on an Excel file or PDF or whatever it may be. And then you upload it to the server to be stored. But let's say you forget to upload it, right? And you don't back it up quickly enough, or you forget to upload it and you get distracted by a meeting or whatever. And then the server goes down. So now you have an issue of whatever file's on the server is actually not the file you want. So backing up, that's why your IT provider or your IT department may be backing up your server and your individual hard drives and your laptops and your desktops, because just in case the server version isn't most up to date, at least you have your backups on your hard drives and your laptops. Well, ultimately, that's a lot of work to back up all those systems, and then that's a lot of space you need, because now you're backing up 2 versions. And so that's just taking up a lot of space on wherever the backups are going. So that's kind of the main issues with traditional storage, is backups. We found that since people are moving to the cloud, we'll talk about backing up the cloud. That's kind of its own problem. That's its own need, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, because that is a problem. And that's something that people aren't talking about is, hey, if your cloud storage gets compromised, or if somebody accidentally deletes your cloud storage or whatever it may be, do you have a backup of it? So we'll talk about that. But I got to tell you, backing up the cloud is way easier than backing up a server or a desktop or a laptop. So ultimately, as we'll talk a little bit later as well, it's much quicker to back up and much easier, much more cost effective to back up the cloud than it is traditional hard drives or laptops. Number 4 is hard to collaborate. So another thing you have is you don't have synchronous collaboration between different computers. One cool part about the cloud is you have the ability to work on a document simultaneously with somebody else anywhere in the world. You can both open up the same document and work on it together during a meeting. And then also, or just work on it at different times and it's automatically saved. So one that's hard part, and I was just actually talking to a law firm a couple weeks ago, and one problem they're having is they all back up their files to the server, but the versions, they're having to re-download it to their laptop, edit it, and then re-upload it to the server, and then their paralegal looks at it, downloads it to their computer, re-uploads to the server, and they get confused with versions. So that's kind of the second point here is version confusion, right? Which version is which? Do you have the most recent one? And then a big problem with that is really downloading and re-uploading files to the server and storing things on your local computer is really kind of is a security risk and a problem as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, the advantages of just having everything in the cloud, because you walking around with your laptop with a bunch of sensitive documents stored on your laptop it has, once again, more, especially for theft, but it just has another point of failure. So another point for people to be able to access those files versus them having all secured in a vault in the cloud. So kind of the two things being, once again, you don't have synchronous collaboration on a document, but then you also have version confusion where you don't have the ability to be able to have a track record of like, oh, here's all the different versions we worked on and which one's the most current and which one should we use. Number 5 is hard to maintain. So servers especially, let's talk about that for a second. Servers are, if you talk to your IT provider or if you manage the server yourself, they're just super costly to maintain. They're they are probably one of the biggest headaches we experience with our clients that still have servers. And we're pushing, and over the past couple of years, we've migrated the vast majority of our clients away from servers because of all these reasons, and then some. But it's also just more costly to maintain a server in a lot of ways. The subscription model you'll get with cloud storage, right? You're paying the monthly fee to Google or Microsoft or Dropbox. If you amortize the cost of a server, not just the hard cost, right? It might cost you $3,000 to buy the machine, but the maintenance of it. Because the second point here being, it requires a high-level IT experience, right? Using Google Drive is much easier than trying to maintain a server, and so you need actually more dedicated IT team members to be able to really be able to manage and maintain the server. But ultimately, we still have clients that use servers, so there is situations where you need a server. For example, if you're using QuickBooks desktop and you want to store that on the server, maybe you're an accounting firm and you don't like QuickBooks Online, right? You want to host it on your local server. There's advantages to that. Maybe you have some proprietary software that you're using that you want to host on the local server. So there is reasons, but cloud storage, like files, documents, PDFs, Word documents, those types of things, having an exclusive server just for that is, I've been with NWTech for 4 years now. I've never seen a situation where we've needed a server just for cloud storage. It's just not a thing anymore. And so if that's what you're using it for, definitely recommend looking at moving to the cloud, just because it's so expensive to maintain and you need to require a high level IT experience to maintain them. And then your desktops, right? Laptops, hard drives, external drives. It's just a lot of physical material. And honestly, the less cables we have to deal with, the less hardware we have to deal with, the better. And as things move to the cloud, it's just easier to maintain. It's more cost effective. It's quicker. And we'll talk about obviously some of the advantages of the cloud. But just in general, if you think about less hardware, it's generally a better move. So having less desktops, less laptops, things like that, you can simplify. It will make your life easier. Less security risks, less maintenance. Hardware is its own problem to maintain. Last but not least, security. I saved the most, probably one of the most important for last. Security is really, over the last year, like I've mentioned, 2019 and then in 2020, just a ton of security. I don't know if you've experienced phishing attempts or your accounts getting attempted to get hacked or things like that. So maintaining security is one thing. So compliance. So if you're in a regulatory industry, HIPAA, FINRA, even if you're a marketing agencies, we're seeing a lot of marketing agencies that are now required to have security policies in place because they manage client data, right? They manage credit card information or opt-in forms or emails or whatever it may be. And so their clients, Netflix actually came out late in 2019. They came out with a requirement for any vendor that works with Netflix. You have to comply by their security requirements, because if they're sharing data with you, they want to make sure you have things, that everything is compliant. So maintaining a server, ensuring that that's compliant is quite challenging, because like I mentioned, all these other reasons, there's many points of failure and there's many points of opportunity for issues of either compromise, theft, or just access, remote access, right? All these different issues. Is it being backed up? Where is it being backed up? Who's accessing it? So maintaining compliance with an on-premise server, a server that's stored in your office, or even your desktops or your laptops, maintaining compliance for that is a lot harder than maintaining compliance in the cloud. And I'll talk to you about Microsoft actually being one of our favorite providers when it comes to security, just because they give you so much ability to track access, to remove users, right? If you have an employee that leaves, you can have permissions in place where they don't have access anymore, because your vendors or the government is either has or will begin to asking you to ensure that you have those things in place. So that's a big issue that we've been seeing of, hey, can you demonstrate compliance with an on-premise server or a hard drive or a laptop or a desktop exponentially harder than in the cloud, because the cloud, they give you the ability to, they know Microsoft knows what all the compliance issues are, so they've kind of baked that into the service in a lot of ways. And your IT provider, whether it's us or somebody else, can help you navigate that and put the permissions in place to make sure you're compliant. Last but not least on security is you can't share with clients securely. That is probably one of the greatest advantages of having stuff in the cloud, is the easy ability to share a document with a client securely. So you can send them a link to a document that's password protected. You can send them a link to a document that they have to log in with their Google credentials or their Microsoft credentials. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations, we see people still sending files by email. And I want to talk about that just for a second, because it's kind of interesting how it works. So if you were to send an email, it's unfortunately, the email actually, once it hits the internet, goes around to a bunch of different servers. So it doesn't just go directly to the other person's server. You know, for example, if you have Google and they have Microsoft, it just doesn't go to the Microsoft server. It actually goes usually through other servers and into the internet, depending on your email setup and so on and so forth. So if any one of those servers goes down or gets compromised, your emails are now compromised. So that's why you probably heard it's definitely not secure to send sensitive documents or any sensitive information by email. I repeat, don't send any sensitive information through an email. It should be password protected. And I'll talk about later on in the webinar, you should not give the password in the email. You should either call them or give it over a secure channel. But ultimately, sharing things via email is not secure. And so just think about that. Whenever you're sending something through email, if it's sensitive, if it comprises some sort of sensitive information, even if it's a text in the email, just always remember that should be a huge red flag to yourself. Like, hey, stop what I'm doing. Don't send it by email. Go to a cloud storage solution to share it, or call them and give them the information over the phone or other sources. So ultimately, storing files traditionally, one of the biggest problems is security, maintaining compliance, and you can't store things, you can't share things securely back and forth with your clients. And then your clients can't send you stuff securely either. That's one big option. Or if a client signs a document, they rescan it and they email it to you, you really want them to upload them to a secure folder. And so we'll talk about that, how you can do that in the cloud, where you can create a secure folder for them, and then they can drop it in that secure folder. Awesome. Let's move on to the advantages of storing things traditionally. There's really two different advantages. One being actually storing things locally. If you are accessing things, large files, it may download a little faster, especially when you have poor internet. So if you have poor internet and you're storing things locally, if you're out in a rural area or traveling, if it's on your laptop, it's going to open up quicker than if it's in the cloud. That being said, internet speeds have just been going like this over the past 5 years. And then generally, the cloud storage devices have been getting more reliable and more secure as well. So it's really not a problem, but we do have, every once in a while, we do come across a client that maybe are in a rural area that doesn't have fast internet speed, and they're dealing with large files. Downloading them, from the cloud and re-uploading them to the cloud can be a challenge. That being said, if you are working on them in the cloud, if you're not downloading them to your computer ever, if you're actually using like Microsoft and actually all the providers, you can edit the document in the cloud. So you actually never download it on your computer. It always stays in the cloud. That is one way to get around it. So sometimes we have like marketing agencies that need to download a file from the cloud, edit it in Adobe. But actually, then again, Adobe has cloud storage as well. So everyone's getting around that problem of, hey, edit the file in the cloud, collaborate in the cloud, store it in the cloud. Never have it stored locally on your computer, because it's faster, it's more secure, and you kind of avoid these issues. The second one is, like I mentioned, you don't need internet access if you're stored locally. So those are kind of the two main advantages. of having things stored locally. But obviously, kind of like we talked about with the other disadvantages, a lot of problems with storing things locally versus kind of the main advantages of storing things locally. And then we'll talk about security in a little bit, because you may be asking, what about security? Is Microsoft secure? Is Google secure? We'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. Awesome. Let's transition over to migration to the cloud. So we're going to talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of migrating to the cloud. In the past 5 years, we've seen an exponential increase of cloud storage, mostly due to decreased cost of services, increased reliability, and improved internet speeds. So those three main reasons: the cost per gigabyte or per terabyte of storage has gone down, the reliability of the providers has gone up, and then all of us, as I'm sure you've experienced, internet speeds increasing. We'll talk about the problems of cloud storage, the first one being backups. So one little fun fact, and your IT provider may have mentioned this to you, or you may have heard this on the internet, but cloud storage providers, Google, Microsoft, Dropbox, they guarantee from loss from their standpoint, right? They have hundreds of thousands of servers. They do redundant, multiple redundancy of your files. So they back them up in multiple places. They're hyper secure, right? They're more secure than us for sure, as far as how we store things locally. However, so listen closely, if you were to delete a file, or if you have a malicious employee delete a file on their way out, or if somebody were to access, let's say a hacker were to access your account, go in and delete all your files or remove them all off and then hold them as ransom, Google, Microsoft, and Dropbox don't guarantee in those situations. So once again, if you were to accidentally delete something, most of them, and we'll talk about this too, most of them have like a 30-day or a 90-day recovery period. You can go recover things. But let's say you accidentally delete something, 6 months down the road, you forget about it, and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot I deleted that. I need to get it. Or if you have a malicious employee delete something, or you have an outside attack to delete something, they're not going to guarantee it. That's not really their fault, right? That was a human error ultimately, and an illegitimate deletion, and that's really not their fault. That was just human error ultimately. And so you still need to back up the cloud. So backing up backing up your files in the cloud, and then backing up your emails as well. Because the same problem, if you were to delete an email and you need it 6 months down the road, you forgot about it, or if somebody were to go, once again, same problem. If somebody were to delete a malicious employee or ex-employee or an outside attack, you're not going to have a backup of that. And they're going to be like, well, you deleted it legitimately, right? So we still recommend backing up the cloud. So we store clients' files in the cloud, but then we also back them up to the cloud. So that's kind of the next thing, is we back them up. So we have our own backup of the cloud in the cloud. That way we have our own backup. That's what we do for our clients a lot of the time. Number two is cybersecurity. So I kind of mentioned that earlier. A lot of the large providers, they're at risk just like anyone. However, if you look at the statistics for cybersecurity attacks, the vast majority of them target small to medium-sized businesses because they don't have the security in place like the Microsoft and the Google and the Dropbox. And so they'd rather get 1,000 small fish than trying to get one huge fish that may be really hard to compromise. Especially in the past couple of years, they've only increased their security. It's not perfect, right? It's no guarantee like anything in life. But that being said, if you go do some research about cybersecurity attacks, the vast majority target small to medium-sized organizations because they don't have the security in place like large organizations. Let's talk about the advantages. So the first advantage is easy to use. If you've used a cloud storage solution, you know it's intuitive, easy access, faster file access. I talked about those things earlier, and I'm sure you've experienced those if you use cloud storage. The next one is securely sharing files. So you can securely share files, like I mentioned, through a password, through a login credentials, and then also your clients can secure upload, right? They can securely upload files to you by creating a folder. Number three, We also kind of hinted at this as well earlier, is collaboration with clients in the team. You can do real-time collaboration, right? If you're remotely or if you're in a different space. Then you also have versions of it. I think Microsoft OneDrive has some of the best versioning tools that you can go back and see all the different versions that were done over I think 90-day period of a document. And it gives you the ability to see, oh, I actually want to go back to that version, or why did my employee do that change to the document? And then things like commenting, right? You can have real-time discussion around a particular aspect to the document. Number 4, more cost effective. Like I mentioned, reasonably priced. It's more easy to scale. If you amortize the cost of servers and hardware, ultimately, it's definitely more cost effective to have things in the cloud. And then easy to back up. Like I mentioned, it's backing up to on-site or the cloud. So a lot of our clients do, sometimes they still want a hard copy of it, like on a hard drive in their basement of their office building. So we have it stored in the cloud. That way you can easily collaborate, easily share with clients securely. But then let's back it up to an on-site location. So you have that security of knowing, hey, I have a physical copy at my location. Or you can back it up to the cloud, which is what most of our clients do as well, is vast majority back it up, have a cloud backup of the cloud, like I mentioned. And then 6, easy to implement and maintain. Much easier to implement. So if you have an IT department, it's just going to be less costly for them to maintain it. Or if you have a provider like us that's doing it, you're going to pay us or somebody else less. You're going to have less of a cost to maintain. And then ultimately, just because it's more reliable and it's easier to implement. Awesome. Like I mentioned earlier, if you know you need help, we have book a meeting with us, 30 minutes, and we can discuss your specific situation. If you go to nwtex.com/get-a-quote, I also have the link in the chat as well. Like I mentioned, go there, schedule a meeting with us. You can book a meeting with us as early as tomorrow if you want to ask us questions, or if you want to talk about your specific situation. No obligation. We can definitely help you with that. Awesome. We got still more stuff to talk through. We're going to be about to jump into the cloud solution comparison. So we're going to talk about the differences of the providers. And then we'll also be talking about your specific questions, and then also practical best practices and so on and so forth. But if you do know you already need help, go to nwtex.com/get-a-quote, book a time with us, and we can help you out there, point you in the right direction. Even if you have an IT department in place or a third party, but they maybe not, you want to get a second opinion, happy to talk to you guys. We're happy to have one of our specialists talk to you and talk through your specific situation. Fantastic. So let's talk about cloud solutions comparison. So we're going to dive deep into what are the differences between Dropbox, Google Drive, and Microsoft OneDrive. Excuse me. So the 3 main providers, they all have a lot of very similar feature sets. They're all stored in the cloud. They all have things like being able to securely share files, do the synchronous collaboration, but they have some key differences that I want to dive deep into here for a few minutes and talk around really what are their key differences, because they're important. And depending on what your technology set you have in place, right? If you're a Google Drive, if you're a Gmail user and you love Gmail email, then you may want to use Google Drive. If you're Dropbox, you may want to use, if you're Microsoft 365, you may want to use OneDrive. So we'll talk through those differences and the pros and cons and what we've seen as successful. So let's talk about Google Drive first. So Google Drive, kind of the pros of Google Drive are, number 1, they have an amazing third-party integration. So if you're trying to integrate with other cloud storage solutions, they have a really great integrations, and they have probably more integrations than Microsoft or Dropbox. And once again, these are the differences, right? So Google wins when it comes to third-party integrations in regards to, like, if you have some obscure tool that's a cloud-hosted tool that you'd like to integrate with Google Drive usually is going to have that integration, whereas Dropbox and OneDrive may not have that integration. That being said, 95% of the time, Dropbox and Microsoft 365 have those integrations in place for all the main ones, but every once in a while, they don't. So if you're looking for third-party integrations, Google Drive is super great for that. If you ever use Google Drive, they have an amazing search capabilities, and the Gmail in general has an amazing search capabilities. So if you're trying to search for a document and you don't have file naming in place that's proficient, their searching capabilities is better than the other two by far. That being said, if you organize your files well and you have a file structure, you probably don't need the search capabilities as much. But if you ever use Gmail, man, it's so amazing to search for documents. I mean, it is Google. They should be the best at search, considering that is what they started with, searching information. And obviously what they do with all their tools. Obviously, if you're a Gmail, number 3, if you're a Gmail user, it's really a great, integrates really well with Gmail, and it works really well with storing your files in Drive and using Gmail. Some of the disadvantages are they really have limited secure sharing capabilities. If you want in-depth secure sharing capabilities, especially if you're in a compliance organization, a lot of our clients have moved away from Google to Microsoft because Microsoft just wins when it comes to business compliance. And we'll talk about that in a second, that Microsoft 365, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, Outlook, all those things, they have amazing abilities to put in security features to make sure that you're compliant with your regulatory board. So if you're HIPAA, FINRA, like I mentioned earlier, a marketing agency, CPA, if you're IRS has a ton of requirements for CPA firms. If you're any one of those organizations, Microsoft has the ability for your IT department to go in and make sure all of your cloud storage is compliant. Number 2 con would be no smart sync options. So the smart sync, I'll talk about that in a second. So basically, it allows you to, all of them have the ability to have a folder on your computer that shows all of your files in the cloud. And you can open them up on your computer and then resave them right to that folder. Google Drive, unlike Dropbox and OneDrive, doesn't have a smart sync where you can right-click on the document and say, hey, I don't want to store this on my computer. Make sure it's stored in the cloud. Basically, you can't have best of both worlds. You only can store, it only will show you what's in the cloud. If you download it to your computer, there's no way to easily just put it right back in the cloud. So that's kind of one of the disadvantages. Number 3 is block level file syncing. So what that is if you're downloading, if you have huge files, right? And you're downloading them or uploading them to the cloud, or excuse me, if they're in the cloud already and you're making changes to them, the cool thing about Dropbox and OneDrive is that they'll do a block level file syncing. So if you make a change, it's not going to re-upload the whole file. It's actually just going to upload the portion that you changed. Google Drive doesn't have that feature, whereas Microsoft, OneDrive, and Dropbox both have that feature. Moving right along to Dropbox. Dropbox pros and cons. The pros are advanced secure sharing. So they have, actually similar to OneDrive as well, they have a lot of advanced secure sharing. The ability, unlike Google Drive, the ability to do a lot of interesting ways of securing and sharing files with your clients back and forth. And then number 2, they have fast syncing between devices. So they're probably, if you are downloading and uploading files from your devices a lot, like I said, if you're not editing them in the cloud, but you're downloading them back and forth a lot, Dropbox has probably the best file syncing between devices. Cons are, it is more expensive, generally speaking, than the other 2 providers. Not by a lot, but it is more expensive. And then number 2, Dropbox doesn't have its own Office apps. So Google obviously has Sheets and the other applications that are Google Documents that you can edit Google Documents. And then Microsoft obviously has the Office suite like Word, Excel, PowerPoint that you can edit in the cloud and use in the cloud. Dropbox doesn't have its own, so you're relying on those other 2 providers. That being said, it has a pretty good ability to open files that are either a Google product or Microsoft product. But that being said, you're still kind of at the mercy of those two applications. So they're sometimes glitchy. Ultimately, if you love Google products, then using them in Google is the ideal. If you love Microsoft products like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, using them in OneDrive, it's just going to be the best experience for you. Awesome. Let's move to Microsoft OneDrive. Microsoft OneDrive, the pros are, number one, if you're an Office 365 user, whether you're in the cloud or even if you just use the local applications, right? If you use Excel on your computer or Office on your computer, there is a ton of integrations. So OneDrive, you can integrate with SharePoint, and there's a ton of awesome integrations you can do there. But if you love Microsoft products, OneDrive is the way to go. So what we've done, spoiler alert, is we've moved a lot of our clients to Microsoft because Microsoft for business, for security, for other things, Microsoft just is one of the best business class solutions we've found. And then also a lot of our clients use Excel or Word or PowerPoint. And so they're working on those. So uploading those to Google Drive or uploading those to Dropbox is not ideal when you could just have them in OneDrive and it just syncs better. And then you can open those. And if you're using Office 365, you don't even need the local Outlook or Word or Excel. You can create and edit all those documents in the cloud. Lots of integrations, lots of awesome stuff. If you guys use Microsoft Teams, or if you guys have heard about Microsoft Teams as a team collaboration tool, that is an awesome tool, similar to Slack, if you heard about those. We've done some previous webinars, so if you can go to our website, you can watch some other webinars we've done on Microsoft Teams and Microsoft in general. But Microsoft is coming out with a lot of great solutions for business collaboration. And if you're looking for file storage, OneDrive is an awesome solution for it. The other two reasons are privacy and security. So privacy, I would, from our experience, privacy and security, Microsoft is definitely, if you're looking for the most secure cloud provider and you're looking for somebody that's going to actually, not look at your files or all of them, if you look at their official documentation, all of them say that if something were to happen, they may access your files for some reason, right? If they're troubleshooting an issue, an engineer might come in. However, Dropbox and Google Drive both publicly say that they will search your information for advertising purposes or search your information to better give you an experience overall with their products. So for privacy, Microsoft kind of goes above and beyond and says they'll never do that. They'll never search your information so they can put an ad in front of you based upon that information. Whereas Google doesn't say that. They'll say, actually, we will search your we will search your emails, we will search your documents so that we can advertise to you better. And then security, like I mentioned, they just have one of the best security abilities. Advanced sharing as well. They give you the ability for a lot of advanced sharing and all that fun stuff. Cons are confusion between SharePoint and OneDrive and poor customer service. So both of these problems can be solved with a robust IT team. So I would recommend if you do want to use OneDrive or the SharePoint in particular, have your IT team help you. Reach out to an organization like ours to help you navigate it because it is complex. Microsoft doesn't make things most intuitive always. And so it can be a little bit more complex to implement. And they don't have the greatest customer service in the world, to be honest. However, their solutions are pretty amazing, and your ability, if you do have the right team in place to implement them, you will get a better experience ultimately. Awesome. Let's just quickly go through these best practices. I see we got some questions coming in. I want to make sure we get to them in the Q&A. The best practices, number one, with secure file sharing, is avoid giving a link to a document without a password protection or login requirement. So you can actually give a link to a document without requiring any security on it. So it's just a link, and they click on the link and the document opens. Avoid doing that because that's not really secure, because if someone were to get access to that email, they could just click on the document and open it up. Number two, set an expiration for sharing permissions. That's just a best practice. If you're sharing something, set an expiration on it. That way, just anything down the road, if there was a password gets leaked or maybe the employee leaves the company, just best practice to set an expiration. Number 3, when creating a folder, make sure you secure it with a password or login. I've already mentioned that earlier. Number 4, like I mentioned earlier as well, don't email the password to the secure file or the folder. Call them or communicate it through a secure channel. Number 5, never email sensitive documents or files. That was the other best practice we talked about earlier as well. Awesome. Like I mentioned earlier, if you need help, go click on Get a Quote, book a free consultation with us. Happy to help you guys out. Awesome. Let's talk about some of your questions. So we got some questions coming in. I want to talk through some of these questions as well. First question, one of the questions that was submitted was how to send confidential documents and what are the best practices. Ultimately, like we mentioned before, the best practices is to store it in the cloud and have a secure link that's password protected or has a login credential to that file. That is beyond none the best practice that we've seen work so far. Everything else, whether you're giving them access to your server, that's a huge red flag. Whether you send it by email, like we talked about, that's not secure. Really, the best way to share a file is to have it stored in the cloud, and have the ability to store it and share it securely. Awesome. The next question was determine how to best migrate our electronic files to the cloud. So this question is a great question, and ultimately, if it's on a server, that's a decommission project. It's a pretty big project to take your server, take all the files, and migrate them. I would rely on your IT provider or reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you talk through what that project would look like to get those files into the cloud and decommission your server. It all depends on where the files are stored. It sometimes is much easier than other situations, but ultimately, if it's depending on how the server is set up, it can be a large project or not. Next one is best practices on where and how to store files on a PC or server. Ultimately, like we've talked about through this whole webinar, storing files and sharing them on a PC or server is not ideal. There is ways, though, obviously, to secure your server and to secure your computer. For example, all your PCs or laptops or desktops should have encrypted hard drives. So if somebody were to access that hard drive, they can't get to the information on the device. So for example, if it's a hard drive on a laptop, you're traveling, somebody steals your laptop, they open up the laptop, they pull out the hard drive. If it's not encrypted, they can just get all those files. If it is encrypted, much harder for them to break it. Same thing with the servers. There's lots of ways to secure your server through VPNs, for remote access, depending on, once again, though, it's much more complex than trying to store things in the cloud. And so if you can eliminate that, that's definitely the best practice. Compliance issues. This question was just talking about compliance issues. And if you're having issues with having your being compliant with storing files on your computer and the IRS, FINRA, HIPAA are saying, hey, this isn't compliant how you're storing files, reach out to us, reach out to your IT department. We can help you navigate those compliance issues. Ultimately, Microsoft 365 suite is going to be your best bet for avoiding compliance issues. And just because it has some of the best security features across the board for us to customize from your email to your cloud storage and so on, that can really help you ensure that you don't have compliance issues. Obviously, nothing's perfect and you're going to have issues, but you can put in the policies, the security policies in place to avoid those. Next is security, recovering old versions of files. System saves original timestamp of files. So this question, I believe, is talking about just recovering old files. Once again, I believe I mentioned earlier, Microsoft 365 has some of the best versioning. So if you're looking at old versions or we're trying to recover old versions of files, Dropbox also has a great recovery, visioning and recovering of versions. Google Drive is decent. They actually but however, if you delete a file within 30 days, they actually automatically, you can't restore it within 30 days. So Microsoft and Google and Dropbox have longer durations. So definitely recommend either Dropbox or Microsoft OneDrive for versioning and recovering of documents. Are my files in the clouds backed up? So like I mentioned earlier, they are. So Microsoft, Google, OneDrive, they all guarantee that they won't lose your file. But if it's deleted, or if you have a malicious attempt from an outside party, or if you have an employee that goes rogue and you unfortunately have to let them go or whatnot, and they delete files on their way out, it's not backed up. If they delete it, a legitimate deletion is not backed up. So we do recommend you back up the cloud. Is the cloud storage safe and easy to transfer ownership when needed? Like we talked about the safety, we've covered that earlier. Transfer of ownership is a great question. Ultimately, ownership transfer, Google Drive, that's from what we've seen, is not very great for transferring ownership between different users. Dropbox and Microsoft OneDrive are definitely superior to that, and having policies in place and just having features in place where you can transfer ownership. So OneDrive, definitely recommend. Dropbox as well for that particular need. Should I aggregate, where should I segregate work from research and personal? So I think they're talking about how do I segregate my personal documents and work documents? Microsoft OneDrive does the best at this. They do a great job of having a personal folder that only you can access, and then you have the rest of your company folders. So I think OneDrive just makes it the most intuitive, where you just have all your personal stuff in the one folder, or maybe it's just something you don't want to share with the team, and then you have all your shared documents everywhere else, and they automatically give you that in place. I use Google Drive, OneDrive, and Dropbox. I really want to streamline. Yes, that's probably a lot of confusion, and we see that happen a lot just because if you use Gmail, you might use Google Drive, but then if you're creating Excel files or Word files, you may want to create those in OneDrive and then you upload them back and forth. Reach out to us. We can help you streamline all that and just reduce it down to one and help you pick which provider is best. You definitely don't need all three of them. I've never seen a situation where we had a client that needed all three of them. So depending on your needs, you can definitely standardize. If you use a Gmail, if you're a Gmail user, you could use Google Drive or Dropbox. If you're if you're a Microsoft user, you can obviously use OneDrive. Awesome. A couple of other questions that came in I'd love to address are, what's your opinion of Ignite? And Ignite's a great solution. It is a little more expensive than some of these other solutions, and it is pretty secure from what we've seen. Ultimately, though, if you're a Microsoft user, OneDrive is the way to go. Ignite, it seems like they have some privacy and security features that are pretty cool. But they're streamlined, and their ability to integrate with other things. Once again, if you're a Google user, use Google products. If you're a Microsoft user, use Microsoft products. Other question, I use Dropbox, but my clients have limited storage unless they have their own Dropbox accounts. Great question. That would be one workaround for that would be to just create a specific folder that's stored on your file instead of it being stored on their boxes, and then just share that document with them. Then you're having to, that comes off of your, obviously your storage usage, but that would be easier and you wouldn't have those issues. So we're at the top of the hour. Just wanted to, thanks for being with us today. I know you guys, if you guys are looking for more help, like I mentioned, you can book a meeting with us to get, discuss your specific needs. Go to nwtex.com/get-a-quote. We'll build a custom plan to help you leverage the benefits of the cloud. We'll help you migrate your files to the cloud and decommission your server or other devices. We'll help you work through that whole process. And then number 4, we'll help you long-term, because ultimately technology is going to change, right? You need to secure, you need to maintain your infrastructure, but you're going to have to constantly evolve. And so these cloud storage providers are great now, but long-term they may change. And depending on what those solutions are, you want to have an IT provider that can be robust and help you navigate all those problems. So once again, if you need more help, be sure to go to our website, nwtext.com/get-a-quote. We'd love to help you, or even just talk about your specific problems, no obligation, and answer any more questions. And then if you want to watch this recording, we'll be sending it out. So expect an email from us with this details. Thanks everyone for joining. Looks like we addressed all the questions that were submitted and the ones that were submitted in advance. Once again, thanks for joining us today. I hope this was educational. I hope this was helpful. Take care, be well, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much.